Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and with video here on YouTube. So welcome to another episode of the Three Apostates. I am joined by Jonathan Streeter, a former Mormon, and Lloyd Evans, my favorite former Jehovah's Witness.
Favorites?
Yes.
How many former Jehovah's Witnesses do you know, Chris?
Wait, does that mean there's a different favorite former Mormon? I'm not.
No. It's all good. It's all good. I have actually a few now, Lloyd.
And I'm the top of the bunch, am I?
Oh yeah, absolutely, definitely
well,
at the top of the.
I expect nothing less. So.
That's right. Oh my God. Yes. Okay. So we are going to talk about 2019. We're going to talk about where things are going with our respective groups, and then we're going to go over a little fun survey / evaluation that grades the relative destructivity of our former groups. And we kind of went through a little 10 or 12 point checklist and assigned some arbitrary numbers to it. And we'll go over some of that and talk about why we chose what we chose on that. So first off, how's it going, guys?
Well, I think in Mormonism, the update on Mormonism is that your viewers may not know, but about a year ago or so, we got a new prophet. We injected some new young blood into the leadership of Mormonism in the form of a 94-year-old former heart surgeon, Russell M. Nelson. So he's our new young blood. And you would think at 94, it's probably going to be stagnant, but he has done some just unprecedented changes in Mormonism, the Mormonism of today as we record
you're not
this.
allowed to call it Mormonism.
This is true. That's a whole part. You're absolutely right.
Get with the program. This is your religion, not even mine. And I'm having to inform you about your religion.
No, that was one of the changes. I was getting there, all right? So, one of the marks of me being apostate is that I can still use the word Mormonism and I don't have to get into an argument about it. So one of the things he did in the last year is he said, don't call us Mormons. And this is in direct contradiction to past prophets who are like paying millions of dollars to fancy PR firms to create a whole I'm a Mormon campaign, which copied a Scientology campaign. And, but that, that's just one thing. That's like superficial fluff. What we just saw last week, January 1st, was a dramatic change to the sacred / secret temple ceremony itself. Now, feminists in Mormonism have been complaining for decades that the ceremony is inherently sexist and puts women at a lesser position, subservient to their husbands, and not even directly in communication with God, because God is only accessible through their husbands the way it was previously set up. The man would covenant with God and the woman would covenant with her husband. But that has totally changed. A lot of those sexist elements have been removed. The prior process where women were compelled to veil their faces was totally eliminated. There's no more veiling of women's faces in the temple. These are changes that if you're just part of an organization and you have a special, ritual that you have, then you can change it and it's no big deal. But when your temple ritual was originally said to be restored to some ancient order as God originally intended it, which is what Joseph Smith and the early prophets did, then to have subsequent prophets change it further just kind of blows your mind. But they've found a way to, in a very Orwellian way, to just smooth all that over. So we're just going to see what the future holds, because he's still making a lot of changes. I mean, another big one was that we went from having a 3-hour block of meetings on Sunday to only 2 hours, which is taking up less of each individual's time.
He changed it so you have less of a time commitment.
That's right.
We had a similar thing with Jehovah's Witnesses. Actually, we used to have 45-minute public talks on a Sunday. They're now 30 minutes, and we used to have an extra meeting in the week, and that got removed as well. I think a lot of it is down to with the with the reduction in the public talk, I think it was down to, for practical reasons and giving people more time to get to and from the meeting, so that less people had an excuse of, oh, well, I just can't justify the traveling time and that kind of thing. But also with the meeting that they abolished, that was a meeting that used to take place in people's homes. And the feeling is that when you have witnesses meeting independently in small homes, it's harder to keep a tab on what they're talking about and whether they're starting to think outside the box. So there's all sorts of reasons why they could want to do that.
Interesting. I find it interesting only because I think that these are, I don't know, do you guys think these are clearly the Mormon actions are a direct response to public outcry?
Outsiders will see it clearly as that, but the prophet says, no, this is a revelation from God. It has nothing to do with PR, nothing to do with the complaints. We, in the past, we've excommunicated women feminists who complained about these things vocally. We're not even going to acknowledge that. There's a video that shows apparently at the beginning of the temple sessions now that says, this has changed, but because of the sacred nature of the temple, you are not to discuss that these changes were made, not to discuss the changes, or even that there were changes in public. That's only for people that are in the temple, at the temple.
Got it. Although clearly people are talking about it because you know about it.
Oh yeah. It's on the news. I mean,
it's a big.
Actually released a PR statement on its news thing, and at the end of it, there was this. When I said it was Orwellian, it says, it talks about that there have been some minor changes to bring things up to the times, and then it says the prophets have said that there will be unending changes, and we're like, what? Because we have a lot of prophets saying that the ordinances of God are unchanging and should never be amended, but we don't have a whole lot of prophets saying, oh yeah, there's going to be endless changes.
Wow, this is so interesting. But also it totally goes along with everything we've ever talked about with this, because I've always said from the get-go that the Mormon church is the most progressive and is the least in the destructive cult flavor of things as far as it's able to respond. I mean, whether they're saying their reasons for doing it are because of public feedback or outcry or whatever, the fact that they are changing is a positive move. I mean, we know it's hypocritical.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we want that change, right?
Yeah. We want to see a change with an acknowledgement of the error, a validation of the harm that existed before, and a restoration of dignity to those people who were vilified before for making these complaints. And none of that happens. So we continue to have an authoritarian religious organization with no apparent internal accountability for what they do. And they continue to do harmful things, but it's just still in the mode of defer to your leaders. The leaders never really make mistakes, and God is at the helm of everything.
But at least having the change is something. I mean, in an ideal world, we would have full accountability and holding your hands up and saying, we got that wrong. It was hypocritical of us. I would frankly I'd be happy to just see reform from a Jehovah's Witness standpoint, but we're not even getting that. Yeah. So with Mormonism, with the Church of Latter-day Saints, at least there is some interest in kind of being, in kind of restoring the reputation and fulfilling the kind of mainstream ideals. That there's no interest in Scientology and no interest in Jehovah's Witnesses in having a good appearance as far as making reforms is concerned. It's a case of we're sticking to this, even if it kills us.
Yep. That's right. What makes Mormonism a more effective virus, a more effective mind virus, is it adapts.
Good point. I get that. I totally get that. Is this akin to how things happened in the 70s when the I don't even know how to describe it.
The priesthood restriction. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, with the African American community.
Yeah, and that is where you have a society around Mormonism came to a knowledge and an acceptance of the problems with sexism and misogyny that were prevalent in society, and they've moved in a direction to acknowledge and try to rectify those things. That happened decades ago in society, and just like with the race issue, Mormonism is following up a few decades late, where they finally acknowledge these things and then do something about it.
Right. Right. Well, I have to say, I mean, I like Lloyd said, I mean, at least it's something better than nothing.
Yeah.
Whereas Scientology and the JWs are just, you know, doubling down on their same level of nonsense right now. And it's totally predictable that that's what they're going to do. What do you see happening as now that, you know, we've had Leah's show out for a while now, Lloyd, and 2019 is now rolling out. What do you see happening with activism on your end?
I see Watchtower circling the wagons, and I'm just now editing, in fact, the best of 2018, the worst of 2018 in terms of the video propaganda. And one recurring theme is this idea of the world is out to get us. We need to pay no attention to any negative media. We need to view ourselves as under attack. We need to envision a day when people with guns will come for us. This is the mindset that is being drilled into Jehovah's Witnesses in 2018, particularly with the increasing exposure through the likes of Leah's show. I don't see that easing. I see that being intensified. I think they really will double down in 2019, and we'll see even more paranoia. Wow.
We have, in the world of Scientology right now, there was just a fatal stabbing of a man down in Australia by a kid who apparently was the son of a Scientologist who was doing services at this advanced organization there. So that's kind of in the media right now, but it's a random event. I don't know that it doesn't seem to be particularly, it seems like there was an unstable kid who was armed, who did something really bad to a Scientologist. And I'm just going to say right now, that really sucks, because that's not at all what any of us want to be seeing, is, you know, people being killed for their ideas or beliefs. So that's kind of very, very fresh right now. But on a longer term, I'm seeing that the Scientology is doubling down on their beliefs and doubling down on, you know, all the nonsense they throw at us critics as far as, you know, the criticism and the lies and the secrets and stuff that they try to use to expose us. But also I'm noticing that there is a there's a case that's been going on for quite a while, an investigation of Danny Masterson, a celebrity who is accused of assaulting 4 or 5 women, including, you know, former women who were Scientologists at you know, celebrity parties he was part of and stuff. And Masterson is a Scientologist himself. And because of this, he was kicked off his TV show. But it's been months and months that the District Attorney of Los Angeles has been sitting on the recommendation that he be charged for, you know, potential crimes that he's been accused of. And she's not moving forward on this at all. And what we've been seeing in the last couple weeks is very clear-cut evidence that the Church of Scientology has been spending a lot of money and a lot of time infiltrating the Los Angeles Police Department, and specifically the Hollywood division, to the point where I feel very safe in saying that the LA City Police Department is completely compromised by the Church of Scientology through their public affairs office and their public relations division that Scientology has been working with the police, to the point where they have Scientology video kiosks in the police departments showing Scientology videos. And
what?
Oh yeah.
Which is entirely against separation of church and state, isn't it?
That's right, completely. And now in the New Year's event, David Miscavige went on stage and talked about how they have a big community program that the Church of Scientology is working with the LAPD on, and they could not be closer. And we saw the district attorney, Jackie Lacey, who was supposed to be prosecuting this case against Masterson, literally smiling in photo ops with Mike Rinder's daughter. Mike Rinder, of course, was on Leah's show, is the co-producer of the show, and his daughter is a Sea Org member who is on a tear to take down Mike Rinder and Leah Remini. So seeing her in a photo op with the DA, both of them smiling at the camera, you know, that and all the other stuff going on with the LAPD, it's very, very clear that they're doing a whole handling very similar to what they did when Lisa McPherson died in the late 90s in Clearwater. They spent millions of dollars boozing and schmoozing all the Clearwater police and legislature and mayor's office. All those people got schmoozed heavily by Scientology to prevent any legal action being taken. And they succeeded in that, as disgusting as that is. And that's what we're seeing now with the LAPD. So I'm a little angry, frustrated, upset about that whole situation, because there's not going to be any justice for Masterson's victims if that's the case. And so it's kind of business as usual for Scientology in many ways, despite the public shellacking and spanking that they've taken over the last couple of years. And I'm not exactly encouraged by that, but it just reinforces the desire to step up, keep talking, keep pushing this, and keep raising public awareness about it, because eventually the public have to, hopefully, keep pushing on this, and we'll get some attention from the legislation.
Surely Scientology is now at the point where it's a dead cult walking, in terms of its ability to recruit new members being rendered entirely impotent. How can it possibly recruit new members with like the Leah Remini's work, with Alex Gibney's documentary? I mean, how do you say, oh, there's a great group for me to join in 2019? Right. I understand that they have an existing membership. I understand why they would want to be loyal, and why they would be entirely sealed off from all criticism. And so it's self-perpetuating from that point of view. But in terms of bringing in new blood, surely Scientology can't do that anymore.
No, they can't. They can't. Actually, and I should say this, actually, in terms of encouraging words I'm getting these days. I was just talking to a friend who has firsthand experience in one of their ideal organizations in the Western United States here, and it's just, I mean, it's beyond ghost town. It's where they're at the point now where they're having to bring Sea Org members into these ideal organizations to staff them, because there's so few staff as well as the public. I mean, it's really
like nice at the museum in every ideal org, is it?
Exactly, they're ideal morgues, and that's that's the kind of the state of Scientology beginning of 2019. It's like business as usual on the legal end. But yeah, they really are crashing and burning on every other front. So I should be
encouraging, isn't it? It's job done as far as that's concerned. It's just what we're waiting for is, of course, for it all to just implode. But realistically, that's not going to happen while again the Sea Org members aren't able to look at critical information.
Exactly. Well. Okay, so let's get into something. Let's get into this evaluation here. This was kind of interesting. A viewer of mine suggested this as an idea of some talking points we could bring up about our various groups, and I thought it was very smart. There is an evaluation called the Advanced Bonewits Cult Danger Evaluation Frame. Now, Bonewits is named after a guy named Isaac Bonewits, and I am very aware of certain controversies connected with him. He was a sort of a wooey, Wiccan type druid guy from the 70s and 80s, and this has nothing to do with him or any of that. This has to do with this evaluation he put together, which I thought in and of itself is quite interesting. And so what we did was there are 12, 13, 18 points on which we have each graded our former groups. And so I thought we'd go through these kind of rapid fire. We don't need to dwell on any of them for too long.
Can we compare our scores right at the beginning? I'm fascinated to know who won.
Sure. Okay, yeah, let's do it. So I've got mine here. So like I said, there's 18 points. We will go over them. They are graded, each one, on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 being the highest or the most extreme, and 1 being the lowest or non-existent at all. And what you do, it's very simple, is you add up the scores based on how you've judged each of the questions. So in my case, I will start. I've got each of my answers listed out here, but the total score for the Church of Scientology on my estimation here was 131 out of a possible 180. What did you guys come up with?
I got 133. I'm 2 ahead of you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hold on. I'm gonna go with because some of them I had a range because the church as it exists today is different from before. So I'm gonna go with the lower of those numbers just to get the benefit of the doubt. 8 plus 8 9 8
You just take your time, Jonathan. It's not like
115.
Waiting.
Hey, just simmer down now, right? All right, 115.
Okay.
115. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, this is really interesting. That came out almost where I thought these were going to come out. That is really cool. Okay, well, let's go ahead and go one at a time through these. The first one of the guide here, and I'll put the link to this evaluation frame in the notes to the show here, so you can find it in the description section on YouTube of this video or at sensiblyspeaking.com. So the first factor is 1, internal control. The amount of internal political and social power exercised by the leaders over members. Lack of clearly defined organizational rights for members. Okay, so that's internal control, first step. So I graded mine as an 8. I thought there's a lot of control exerted over individual membership in Scientology, but I didn't want to make it a 10 because that's kind of an absolute figure. And there are some people who fly under the radar, get away with some things from time to time. So I thought 8 was a decent judge for value for that one. What did you guys come up with?
I went with 10 only because I think that when it gets to the point where you actually will lay down your life due to the control, which is the end game for Jehovah's Witnesses, if, for example, blood transfusions are in the balance. You know, when an organization has that level of control where you're actually willing to die for your beliefs, then I don't know how you can have more control than that. So I've given them a 10 for that.
Good. Jonathan?
I also went with an 8, and I think that a lot of the stuff that you mentioned about Scientology, where even though the institution has a lot of controls in place, there's still a little bit of wiggle room where people can kind of differ from the main line a little bit, as long as they don't make too big a deal about it and something won't necessarily go. I think there's certainly a lot to talk here about the difference between institutional control within the hierarchy of the organization versus the control it has over the mind and choices that each individual makes for personal decisions like blood transfusions. In Mormonism, it includes what food you eat, as well as what clothing you wear, as well as whether or not you serve a mission. All those things are part of the control, and it's a big part of being Mormonism. We have leaders saying that if you're Mormon, it affects every decision you make every day, what clothes you make, who you associate with. And I think that's all true for all 3 of our groups. Yep. Just that the consequences for varying from that differ. And that's where I think Mormons still have a little bit of autonomy in that regard.
Agreed. Okay, cool. Second point then is external control. And what it says here is the amount of external political and social influence desired or obtained. Also, emphasis on directing members' external political and social behavior. So on this one, I also put an 8 because Scientology does absolutely exert a great deal of control on members, especially when it comes to political and social behavior. I mean, there's all kinds of rules and guidelines within Scientology for what you can and can't do, can and can't say, that kind of thing. But also, they definitely tell their membership, you know, who to vote for, who the suggested candidates are on the ballot that'll forward Scientology's goals and ideals in a political sphere or social sphere. So there's a lot of work done by Scientology on that, and they push their membership on it. So I figured 8 was a good one for me.
I put 2 for Jehovah's Witnesses because Jehovah's Witnesses are supposed to be apolitical and encourage dissuade their members from voting. But now that I'm thinking about it, I think 2's being a little modest because in truth there are examples in the past of For example, Watchtower getting into bed with the United Nations for influence on the world stage. And they do direct members' external political and social behavior, if only by telling them not to vote and not to be involved in any way, shape, or form. So I've given them a 2, but I probably could have given them more on that.
Mormonism's a little different. I think in all of these questions, there's a double-sidedness to it. So Mormons, we pay a lot of emphasis on free agency. Everybody has their free agency. Everybody can choose. But then we load that choice with all sorts of different things in our culture and what our leaders say to the faithful versus what they say to the public people. And then not only that, but it's changed over time. So if you go back to where Joseph Smith started the religion, he secretly formed a council of 50 whose goal was establishing a theocracy, and he unified religious and political leadership in the city that he created. He was the mayor and the president of the church. And he also used his influence as a prophet to get favors from the outside world by saying, we will all vote for a particular party or a particular candidate. And then his going back on that word ended up creating some problems that led to his death. And there's just all sorts of political stuff in the back. And we think, oh, well, that's all in the past. But there have been some recent leaks from Mormon leaks of videos even more recently where U.S. senators meeting privately with the prophet are basically kissing the ring and showing that even though they're senators, the quote there was that his temple recommend was more important than his voter certificate, which gives him a seat in the Senate or in Congress. And so there's still that political ambition behind the scene. If you live in Utah, the church has people called the home teachers, which are lobbyists for the church itself that compel Utah senators and lawmakers to vote the right way, or else if they step out of favor with the church, they'll lose their constituency. And so there's a lot of political control behind the scenes, even though over the pulpit, they'll say you're free to vote for whoever you want to vote for. Just remember the principles of the gospel. And by the way, those happen to mostly be Republican conservative principles.
So what number did you give on that?
I gave a 7.
A 7, right? Yeah.
Yeah, mostly because people still feel like they're free to vote for whoever they want to, and the control is a little more subversive.
That's interesting, though, because it is a dual thing there, because you have that behind the scenes activity, which you definitely have with Scientology as well. They're funneling money and influence, and they're doing influence peddling and stuff as much as they can with local politicians and civic leaders. So yeah, cool. Okay, point number 3. This is an interesting one. Wisdom/knowledge claimed by leaders. Amount of infallibility declared or implied about decisions or doctrinal, scriptural interpretations. Number and degree of unverified and or unverifiable credentials claimed. That's an interesting one. Now on this one, I just saw the word infallibility and I thought, yep. And also in terms of the interpretation of the scriptures, so to speak. So I put a 10 on this one. I think this was the only one I actually said 10 on. Nope, there's a couple others. But this one was I thought this was I thought Scientology took this kind of thing as far as you can. So that's why I put a 10 on it.
I put 8, but I probably should have put a 9. It's a similar thing with Jehovah's Witnesses. The wisdom is supposed to be, infallible. You're following God's one and only true organization with wisdom and guidance that's being passed from heaven via the Holy Spirit. The only thing is that aware of the fact that they have made mistakes, aware of the fact that there have been flip-flops in teachings through the years. The official line is that the faithful slave or governing body is not infallible and is imperfect. So they say that just as like a token gesture of modesty, but in real terms, they expect people to adhere to what they say as though it is infallible, to the point of dismantling people's families if anyone fails to toe the line.
Yeah. I think you're talking a bit too. Also, if you look at this question and the one right after it, this is the one where what do leaders claim? And the one right after it is what do members believe about the infallibility of the leaders? In that dual nature, in the past in Mormonism, it was very, very high. Prophets, basically, there's a talk called, if you Google the 14 fundamentals of following the prophet, it says things like the prophet is the only man who speaks for the Lord in everything. He's not required to have any particular training or credentials to speak on any subject on any time. He doesn't have to say, thus saith the Lord. He's not limited by, it's this whole line of things which basically take your justification for questioning anything he says away. And that's how it existed in the past. But we have more recent statements from our leaders saying, just because I'm a general authority doesn't mean I'm an authority in general. And so there's a duality there. The leaders are coming to terms a little bit more with their own infallibility. They've always said they weren't perfect, but members, as we'll see in the next one, always believed that they kind of were. So I gave them, it's still a high score. I think we're at a 7 now, whereas in the past we were more at a 9 or a 10. I think we've softened it a little bit.
Okay, cool. Just an additional note on this I thought of, as far as this knowledge or wisdom claimed, a lot of these groups, these destructive cults or high control groups or, whatever you want to call them, make it very clear to their membership over time that they are the most important thing going on in the world. There isn't something else that takes precedent or trumps what they're doing. But Scientology, I don't know about if it specifically says that anywhere in the Mormon or JW doctrines, but it does in Scientology. L. Ron Hubbard specifically stated, Scientology is the one thing senior to life because it explains all of life. So he put it right at the top, right in the dogma, Do you guys have that?
We get messages regularly where leaders are saying the most important thing that you can do is to be obedient, to do the things that we tell you to do. And the choices that you make, that's why they'll say like spiritual pornography, which is like anti-Mormon literature and stuff like that, is more damaging than real pornography because you can repent from viewing real pornography. But spiritual pornography that makes you lose your testimony, that takes you out of God, that has eternal implications. And so that tells you there that the priorities there are really your allegiance to the group is the most important thing, and doing what the group expects you to do is the prime thing. So that concept is certainly there.
And again, with Jehovah's Witnesses, we're at the point where you are expected to die in the case of blood transfusions rather than disobey the wisdom of the leaders.
Right. Perfect. Okay. Next one, point number 4 then, is wisdom knowledge credited to leaders by members. Amount of trust in decisions or doctrinal, scriptural interpretations made by leaders. Amount of hostility by members toward internal or external critics and or toward verification efforts. So this is kind of a dual thing here with this. I put a 9 on this one, only because there are some people within the world of Scientology who will question, look at, what's true for you is what's true. Like there's a little bit of wiggle room within the scriptures for you to have a little bit of independent thinking, but not a whole lot. And you will be brought to toe eventually. And of course, we know about how Scientology treats its critics. And that's universal throughout Scientology. All Scientologists really, really come down hard on apostates and critics. So that's why I put this one at a high score of a 9.
I put an 8, but I really should have put a 9. I didn't put a 9 because I didn't put a 10, because it said amount of hostility by members toward internal or external critics. And although there is a lot of hostility and calling of apostates mentally diseased and that kind of thing, I just figured, well, at least they're not coming after us with violence or advocating our slaughter. Or in the case of Scientology, certainly in the past of Scientology, there's been people made bankrupt. So I'm quite grateful in a way that that's not happening. But yeah, I think 8 or 9 is quite fair. Yeah.
Cool.
For Mormonism, I think the part where they talk about trust in the leaders and attributing wisdom and knowledge to the leaders is off the charts 10. They are the mouthpiece of God. But then when you talk about hostility towards critics or towards apostates, they're softer, definitely. So I ended up coming around to 9.
Great. Okay, cool. Okay, point number 5 is dogma. Rigidity of reality concepts taught. Amount of doctrinal inflexibility or fundamentalism. Hostility towards relativism and situationalism. All right, so on this one, I scored a 10. I said these guys are about as hardcore as you can get when it comes to this is the way, L. Ron Hubbard is the way and the light, so to speak. They don't really say it that way, but, you have to follow the dogma specifically. Keeping Scientology working is front and center, top priority within the world of Scientology. And that means absolutely literal, dogmatic interpretation of the texts. And there is no two ways to do Scientology. There is only one right way. And Hubbard beat that with a hammer many, many times. So that's why I put a 10 on this one.
Yeah, it's a strong 10 for Jehovah's Witnesses as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mormonism, like we talked about, they adapt. And I think the dogma is there in that what the prophets declare to be real, to be doctrine, is doctrine. The members themselves don't have flexibility in determining what is doctrine. It's the leaders that do, but the leaders can change, and change is part of the gospel. They're open to revelation. So I softened it a little bit. I still give it a very strong score of 9, but there's a caveat that things can change.
Nice. Yeah, I think your group is the only one that has anything like that for us, Jonathan. The idea of change or revelation doesn't really exist in Scientology at all. Every single change Miscavige has made, every one, has been back attributed to an error somebody made in interpreting or writing down Hubbard's words, not because what Hubbard wrote was wrong in some fashion and needed to be revised. Every change was back to how L. Ron Hubbard intended it in the first place.
Well, we have new light, but I guess you could say it's similar because this new light is attributed to Holy Spirit and to, because we're so close to the last days, Jehovah's chosen to reveal this right now, right at the last minute, so that we have a fuller understanding than we did previously. So it's all attributed to being increased wisdom from on high.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And we have the concept that God teaches line upon line, precept upon precept, according to the spiritual conditions of the people. And so we can always justify any change by saying that now the members are ready for it. And that becomes a problem because depending on what gets changed, it implies that people before were not ready for it. So now the members are ready to treat Black people as equal. Well, that means that before they couldn't. Now the members are ready to let women pray in sacrament. That's like, well, what was different before that the members weren't ready for that? But we'll take it as it comes.
Yeah, exactly. All right, point number 6 is recruiting. Emphasis put on attracting new members, amount of proselytizing, requirement for all members to bring in new ones. So on this one, recruiting is emphasized at a local level. Individual Scientologists are heavily encouraged to share the wisdom of Scientology, to be shining examples of Scientology in the big wide world so that they will attract new members. And there's actually a series of steps L. Ron Hubbard wrote down, 4 steps every Scientologist is supposed to learn in order to proselytize and bring new people in. So it's part of the dogma, it's part of the scene, but I only scored this at a 6 because Scientology is not really engaged in any kind of effective or even really much of any kind of campaign to bring in new members.
You've got Super Bowl, lads.
What about your yellow shirt wearing volunteer ministers? That's a
that's
a Super Bowl, yeah.
It's a little bit of a thing. And I was just about to bring up the Super Bowl ad, right? Because last year they did a, are you, Scientology, are you curious, ad? And it bombed. It bombed horribly. It bombed as hard as you could possibly imagine because the responses to it was, yeah, I'm curious where Shelley is. I'm curious when David Miscavige is going to jail. Those were literally the kind of responses they were getting to their ads. So their ability to correctly measure what the message should be in recruiting to the big wide public and the effectiveness of it is so bad. It's so horrible, and they make so few efforts to even do it, that I thought, this is not a super high score. They're not really pushing that hard for new members. So I put it at a 6.
It's a strong 10 for Jehovah's Witnesses. When you get to the point where, and this is one of the videos that makes it into my 10 worst of 2018, when it gets to the point where they're making cartoons telling children to involve themselves in recruiting new members for the group, well, what more do you need? So I rest my case, Your Honor. It's a strong
Yes, I agree. I'll tell you, I'm surprised Scientology hasn't taken a page from what the JWs are doing with those cartoons.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and in a way, they've already taken a page, because I know that video propaganda has been a thing for the Church of Latter-day Saints for some while. I'm going to do my very best to use the official terminology. It's been a relatively recent thing with Jehovah's Witnesses, really kicking off around sort of 2013, 2014. But you guys are a little bit slow to take it up. And it wouldn't surprise me if a few lessons have been learned by looking at Watchtower and looking at the Church of Latter-day Saints in what they're doing.
Yeah.
See, you're just so willing to surrender your mind to the leaders. Use the name they want to use. I refuse. No, I think, Chris, when I listen to you talk about Scientology, I think of that Mark Twain quote where it's like, it's better to be thought an ignorant fool and remain silent than to open your mouth and remove all doubt, or something like that. I'm like, once the public has moved beyond being able to believe some of that crap and see it for what it is, then if you try to proselytize by showing people what you got, that's just going to chase them away even further.
That's right. That's right.
But for Mormonism, I think, I gave them a 10, and I have to acknowledge, the caveat there that Lloyd's, the J-Dubs maybe should be 11 so that I can be a 10.
No, you have to be a 9, I'm afraid.
No. We got to be 10. Because, like the Mormon, Book of Mormon musical is about the missionaries. The missionaries is just like, that's how the world knows Mormonism. And it had enough of a clean visage and close enough to Protestant Christianity that it could do a rabid missionary effort in the past and have some success in that. We're finding that that's becoming less and less the case, but there's still a strong missionary mentality. We've just kind of condensed it to those 2 years rather than what Jehovah's Witnesses have of their entire life.
Actually, I've just remembered how far behind you are with the scores. So just to show how gracious I am, I'm going to award you the extra point. It should have been a 9. It's a 10. Well done, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Awesome. All right, guys. Okay, next point, number 7, is front groups. And this was interesting. Number of subsidiary groups using different names from that of the main group, especially when connections are hidden. Now, Scientology is fairly famous for some of its front groups, WISE, ABLE, Applied Scholastics, etc., Narconon, Criminon. I mean, they have these groups out there. They do exist. There are people pushing on them. But I scored this pretty low because I actually only put a 4 on this one. And the reason why is because those front groups are, for the most part, exposed. And there are not really that many of them. And this speaks to the number of subsidiary groups using different names. Scientology has a good number of them, excuse me, but they're not that active. They're not that big. In fact, they come up and die off just as quickly, almost on a daily basis. So yes, there's front group activity. Yes, it's dangerous. I'm not condoning it or saying it doesn't matter. But in a relative picture of things, when I look at other groups, I thought, Scientology's waned quite a bit in their push on that line of country. So I only gave it a 4.
I gave Jehovah's Witnesses the minimum of 1. There is a little bit of that goes on, but it's not really for sort of nefarious reasons. For example, they'll set up websites for selling property where it's not immediately clear that it's Watchtower that's doing it, or they'll set up websites for selling cars that have been used by circuit overseers or representatives that visit different congregations to sell them on to others. So it does happen a little bit, but it isn't really for any nefarious purposes. For the most part, if a group is set up by Jehovah's Witnesses, it's very clear that it is Jehovah's Witnesses.
I think Mormonism is very similar. This question seems geared more to like kind of what the Moonies sort of did, where they had groups recruiting on college campuses under different auspices that then funnel into the organization. Mormons generally want to have their brand on anything that they do because it gives credit to the organization. There are only a few things that are a little bit shifty in that regard. So some of the genealogy websites are technically owned by the church, but they're not actually branded like that. And then there'll be some things like, you know, there's a website, I forget what it's called, but if there's a service need in your area, you can go to the website and type in your area and it'll say, these are some things you can do for service. And so but that's not really a recruitment tool on its face. So I give it a very low score of probably 1 or 2.
Does the Church of Latter-day Saints own or operate any underwear manufacturers, Jonathan?
Only its own. And it did, you know, it used to sell the pattern and you can make your own, but it did consolidate that to itself. But that's only for the truly faithful. So it's not really a recruiting tool.
It's not the sort of thing where you would be a customer.
No, I couldn't get that.
Are they comfortable, that underwear?
They're changing constantly with new fabrics and everything. They're more comfortable now than they were when they were first envisioned, which was, you know, all the way to your sleeves, all the way to your ankles, a one piece that you wore.
When you say they're more comfortable now, this implies that you are testing them quite frequently.
No. So the thing is, you'll find with a lot of Mormon men is that they just don't want to have to go buy the things, because if you're going to buy 7 pair, then you have to get the bottoms and the tops. It's like $100, and it's like you get them and you wear them out. Like there are holes, they're dingy and gray, but the symbols are still there. You keep wearing them until a parent, a significant other says, "Why in the world are you still wearing these? You're disgracing your covenants." And then you're forced to get rid of them. And then to get rid of them, you've got all this underwear. You've got to find the symbols, cut them out, and burn the symbols, and then you can get rid of the underwear. There's a whole...
For the record, I am down for us doing an entire episode on Mormon underwear. You know,
I actually, now that I was just thinking the exact same thing, because I have so many questions. Okay, and I didn't want to derail this conversation on that, so we are going to take that up.
Good.
Okay, number 8 is wealth. Okay, amount of money and or property desired or obtained by group. Emphasis on members' donations. Economic lifestyle of leaders compared to ordinary members. This was an easy 10. Scientology is a money-making scam. David Miscavige is living up high on the hog here while the rest of the membership is down in the sewers. Intense amount of effort on fundraising and money and donations. So it was pretty easy answer on this one.
I gave an 8 because it's not really set up like that for Jehovah's Witnesses. It's not as overtly a money-making scam as it is with Scientology. In fact, as I've said before, you could conceivably make it all the way to the top of the ladder without giving a cent, so long as you keep that information to yourself. There is, however, a big onus on property, on new construction projects, on donations, especially over recent years. Jehovah's Witnesses have been pummeled with solicitations for donations, for example, in video broadcasts. So, and there is, I feel, a disparity. Although Jehovah's Witnesses tend to argue, oh, well, it's not like the donations are lining the pockets of the governing body and they're kind of going around in yachts and what have you. The truth is that they do live very comfortably compared to, I would say, the average Jehovah's Witness, considering as well that a lot of the growth is coming from sort of third world countries. So I think 8 is a reasonable reflection.
I think it's so cute that you're like, oh, Scientology is all about the money. That's like doing basic math compared to Mormonism, which is doing advanced calculus that you can't even see or understand. I mean,
don't get your magic underwear in a twist, Jonathan. We're all on your side.
There is just a huge, like, even if we stopped proselytizing, stopped getting more. There is so much financial reserves and financial solvency in the church itself. It could last, on basically a self-sustaining perpetual endowment of its current reserves. And on top of that, the point that Lloyd made with, we look at the prophets, they're not running around in jets. They're not, wearing Rolexes and stuff like that, but they are very comfortable. We say that we have a lay leadership, but they make a 6-figure stipend every year. On top of that, all their medical is covered. Their kids get to go to church schools for basically free if they still have kids at that age that they get there. But they don't have to worry about any medical cover, anything. Basically all the worries in their life are gone except for being involved in the church. And we compare that to maybe middle upper class America, and it's not too different. But if you compare to where we're seeing growth in the church in the third world, where people, not only are they struggling to make ends meet in areas where they're hit by famine or any other number of problems, but then we send our prophets and apostles over there. And I have a video recording where one of them said, the principle of tithing is if you want to be a good patriot, he's talking to youth in Africa. If you want to be a good Ugandan, a good, patriot for your country, pay tithing. Send your money to a multi-billion-dollar corporate church in America, and that is going to uplift your country. Like that type of messaging, and then with the notion that this is what God wants you to do, is very damaging, very hurtful, and it to me that is more revealing than any Rolex that a leader would wear or anything
Jonathan,
like that.
Did you give yours a 10 by any chance?
I absolutely did.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, speaking of Rolexes, I will say that Dave Miscavige was photographed within the last month with an $8,000 Rolex watch. So I think he's living pretty high on the hog.
Although that's a cheap Rolex. I mean, that honestly.
Well, I'm just saying. Okay, we're only about halfway through, so we got to cruise through these. 9 is sexual manipulation of members by leader of non-tantric groups. That's an interesting limitation there. Amount of control exercised over sexuality of members in terms of sexual orientation, behavior, and or choice of partners. So on this one, on sexual manipulation, I put an 8. David Miscavige does not force sexual favors from Scientologists. Scientology is not the family. They don't do flirty fishing. They don't,
That's the next one, though. You're getting confused with point 10.
Sexual favoritism?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Sexual manipulation of members, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Well, on this one, the grade of 8 came in because the amount of control exercised over membership sexuality is very high, and behavior and that sort of thing. But it's not exercised in terms of choice of partners as far as any kind of arranged marriages or anything like that. There's nothing like that in Scientology. So there's still a lot of wiggle room in this area. Scientology just has a very conservative morality in regard to sexuality, and that's about, how much manipulation is going on there. So I put an 8.
It's a strong 10 for me. You're not allowed to be gay. If you are gay, you'll be destroyed at Armageddon. You're not allowed to marry outside of the group. You are not allowed to masturbate. You're not allowed to have sex before marriage. There's a whole lot of sexual repression that goes on. And it really influences people mentally and emotionally. So I've put a 10 there.
Cool.
Yeah. I put a 9. It's a little bit softer than what Lloyd describes for Jehovah's Witnesses, but a lot of those same prohibitions are in place for Mormonism. We're becoming a little bit more accepting of gay individuals, but we still don't allow them the dignity of marriage or participation in full church service if they choose to live that lifestyle. But there's still a great deal of sexual repression. Marriage is the threshold at which one is able to have sex and feel like they're still in God's graces, and everything that goes along with that. So I give it a 9.
Cool. So 10, sexual favoritism, as Lloyd mentioned, advancement or preferential treatment dependent upon sexual activity with the leader of non-tantric groups. So yeah, this is direct index of.
Hey, hold on. I didn't look into this guy's background, but is there any chance that when you said he had some issues, this Bonowitz guy, did he start a tantric group?
I don't know.
Because that's an interesting little caveat right there. Yes. They'd be like, oh, these cults are bad, but if you're non-tantric, then it's cool.
Yeah.
Or if you're tantric, I guess.
Can't speak to that. But okay. But on this one, I had to actually put Scientology at a 0. This just doesn't happen. This isn't how it works in Scientology. You don't have to sleep your way to the top. There is no sexual favoritism this way. David Miscavige, if anything, the guy is asexual at this point. We have no evidence. I mean, there's tons of conjecture, but there is 0 evidence that David Miscavige sleeps around or sleeps with people or, has had even one instance of out of wedlock sex. He hasn't seen his wife since 2006 or whatever, but sex has just never been a thing in Scientology, and it wasn't for L. Ron Hubbard either. There are, he had, young women servicing him, bathing him, changing his clothes, but there is not one claim ever made in all those years by any of those women who grew up, came out of Scientology, have written books, have talked about L. Ron Hubbard extensively. Not one instance of him ever inappropriately touching them or doing anything like that. So I had to put a 0 on this one.
Well, you put 0, I've put 1 being the minimum according to the instructions that I could give.
Oh, yes, 1. I should have put a 1.
You might have shortchanged yourself there, but yeah, I put 1. There isn't really any sexual favoritism among Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yep.
In Mormonism, it has changed. In the days of Joseph Smith, absolutely there was sexual favoritism. We're going, in the historian group that I'm a part of now, we're going and looking at the land deed records in the city of Nauvoo, which Joseph Smith was mayor of, and by the way, the registrar of deeds of, and the major landowner of. And when he engaged a woman as a secret plural wife, right now we're in the process of getting the chronology round up, but we have records of him granting through a shady type of purchase land to these women, including some teenage girls who were his secret brides. And so if you entered into that relationship, you were given favor within the community and you were brought into the inner circle. And that was absolutely a dynamic of that persisted into Brigham Young, where he had, once you have polygamy as part of your system, all of these sort of influences are in the mix. That being said, in the modern era, in the modern age, the leaders themselves are conventional, monogamous, atomic family sort of people, and I think this doesn't really play a role in leadership as it exists in the church today.
Cool. All right, point number 11 is censorship. Amount of control over members' access to outside opinions on groups, its doctrines, or leaders. I initially put a 7 on this, but I'm going to change it to a 9. Because there is an excessive amount of control over Scientologists' ability to look at information, even on the internet. They attempt to police it at an absolute level. I say 9 because they are not successful at policing it to an absolute level. Public members of Scientology, can and do look at stuff on the internet that they shouldn't be looking at all the time. It's much harder for staff members or Sea Org members to get away with it because they're more rigidly policed in their behavior. So that's why I said 9 rather than a 10.
I've gone with a strong 10 in every way that they can realistically censor Jehovah's Witnesses from looking at outside information or information that's critical of the group. They absolutely do it. They say that if you look at apostate information, you're feeding at the table of demons, that terrible things will happen to you if you entertain negative, even just negative articles in the media. It doesn't even have to be from apostates. It could just be media articles that are negative about Jehovah's Witnesses. They speak in very strong terms about what will happen to you if you do that. So in every realistic way that they could censor people, they absolutely do.
Yeah. Mormonism used to be at that position that Lloyd's talking about at a 10, but it's softened a lot to the extent now where we have the church sponsoring its own academic endeavor to try to make the early writings, the early records of the church available, including some very damaging things if you follow the implications out. It always does it with its own faithful reframing, but it invites members to investigate. And so I think we're starting to see that scale go from a 10 down. I would say we're probably at a 7 right now and dropping.
Cool. Okay, point number 12 is isolation. Amount of effort to keep members from communicating with non-members, including family, friends, and lovers. So on this one, I scored a 7. Obviously, disconnection and issuing suppressive person declares is a massive effort to, isolate former members and keep existing members from talking to them. But as far as interacting with non-members, Scientologists are free to do so, whether they're family, friends, or otherwise, provided that person is not rabidly antagonistic to Scientology. So you can marry outside Scientology, you can be associated with people who are not Scientologists, and nobody's going to particularly bat an eye or get all weird about it unless, like I said, that person's causing some kind of trouble. So that's why I put a 7 on this one.
I put an 8 because you're not really supposed to have dealings with the outside world when you're a Jehovah's Witness. You can obviously have a job, but even when you have a 9-to-5 office job, you're not supposed to really socialize with the people you're working with. You're to view people who don't share your beliefs as a corrupting influence, bad association. So there is a lot of isolation that goes on. It's just not total isolation, because you are at least allowed to take jobs. You are at least allowed to talk to people at the store. It's just the extent to which you communicate that's limited.
Yeah, and I gave Mormonism a low score in this regard, maybe a 2 or a 3. We're invited to be out in the world, to go as far as we want in any academic or employment endeavor that we want. And those contacts are actually kind of exploited for proselytizing opportunity, whether you're trying to get them into the church or whether you're trying to let your light shine forth and just increase the standing and stature and public image of the church itself. But the culture of the church tends to create pockets of isolation within community. So if you go into Utah, a lot of the neighborhoods are 100% LDS. And if you're the non-LDS person who moves in there, while you may initially be love bombed, if you reject or hold the church at a distance, then you may find that your kids aren't invited to play and things like that are just results of culture more than the church saying that you have to isolate yourself. So that's right where I stand.
Yeah, social controls. All right. 13, dropout control. Intensity of efforts directed at preventing or returning dropouts. On this one, I put a 6. I personally engaged in going out knocking on doors to get people back into Scientology. So there are efforts made to recover Scientologists. But at the same time, if somebody, hits the streets, hits the skids, takes off, there's definitely an attitude of, well, we'll pick him up next lifetime. Screw that guy, sort of attitude. So it waxes and wanes. It depends on the fad of the moment as to whether we're all about getting people back in, or screw them, we'll just go find some new blood. It vacillates. So I gave it a 6.
I gave Jehovah's Witnesses a 7 because there is in fact a brochure titled Return to Jehovah. So they've at least gone to the trouble of making propaganda expressly targeted at appealing to inactive witnesses to come back. They've also done videos along those lines. But realistically, if you are a Jehovah's Witness and you go inactive, you are, again, classed as bad association. So individual members aren't going to go to any efforts to bring you back in. You might get a visit from the elders periodically to try and encourage you to return to the meetings. But realistically and practically, there's very little effort that goes into encouraging waned Jehovah's Witnesses to come back.
Yeah. In Mormonism, they always pair that reactivation with missionary efforts. And so it rides on the coattails just in terms of efforts. So it has a high score in that regard. But we're starting to see now where if you're starting to question or be public about your doubts, your leader will come to you and say, listen, if you just want to resign, then we don't have to do an excommunication process or anything. And they're almost inviting resignations of troublesome, noisy people. And so that's a little bit of a different shift from them, always inviting. But even when you leave, the brochure they send out is, please come back and feast at the table with us. And so it's still there. And then you'll see it referenced in Married to Missionary Efforts almost in every general conference.
Cool.
So I gave it a 7.
7 on that one. Okay. Number 14 is coming down the home stretch here is violence. Amount of approval when used by or for the group, its doctrines, or leaders. On this one, I scored low. I put a 4. Violence is approved of in certain circumstances when you're dealing with, say, a critic of Scientology or, and I mean in a very direct way, like if you had a protester outside, there have been, pushes and shoves and screaming and what are your crimes? And, when was the last time you killed a baby and this kind of nonsense? Verbal violence, really. As far as actual violence, it's really not sanctioned or approved by the Office of Special Affairs within the church because they know that, Scientologists going to jail is not a good look for them. So they don't, particularly push that. But there are covert acts of violence that are committed all the time as part of fair game. So I put a 4.
I put the minimum score of a 1 because say what you will about Jehovah's Witnesses, one thing you cannot say is that they're a violent group. In fact, that's one thing that I appreciate. It's actually given me the confidence to do things like go and shoot videos at the headquarters complex, because I know that the very worst thing that could happen is that there will be an awkward conversation and that there will be people feeling uncomfortable with the situation. There will absolutely never be any violence toward me by a Jehovah's Witness, or at least if that were to happen, it would be more a case of a mental imbalance in the individual rather than something that's ordained by the organization. So it's a 1 from me.
Cool.
Yeah. I think Mormonism as it is today is very low. It's a 1. I say maybe a 2 just because there are examples in what is currently canonized scripture of justified violence. Specifically, if you look for the beheading of Laban in the Book of Mormon, it's a beheading of an incapacitated individual. If you go back in time to early Mormonism, there was a doctrine called blood atonement in which one of the early prophets, Brigham Young, gave a theological framework to justify violence, even up to murder, as something that you could do out of love to somebody who apostatized or committed any number of other sins. And it's an uncomfortable and disappointing and ugly part of Mormon history that led to things like the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And so that it was very strong in the past. Not only that, but you have Joseph Smith writing to a 19-year-old girl who had rebuffed his advances of secret plural marriage by laying out something in what's called the happiness letter, which basically says even something like murder, which may be wrong in one instance, can be considered righteous in another instance if you're commanded to do it by a man who is a prophet of God. And so there's some dark shadows of violence in the past, but Mormonism as it exists today is not condoning violence in any way.
Cool. 15, paranoia, amount of fear concerning real or imagined enemies, exaggeration of perceived power of opponents, prevalence of conspiracy theories. Okay, I've gone and I've talked for hours about Scientology's nonsensical conspiracy theories. This is definitely a 10. They're just out the roof on this crap.
Yeah, it's a strong 10 from me. Yeah. As Exhibit A, I offer a book that was released at the annual meeting in October about prophecy. And in one of the illustrations, it shows like a situation room at the White House or at the Pentagon where they have a bank of TV monitors looking at the headquarters at Warwick, at one of the governing body members, at Jehovah's Witnesses out preaching, including children preaching. And this is the level of interest that Satan's system of things is supposed to have in Jehovah's Witnesses, either now or in the near future. And so I rest my case on that. It's a
Mormonism, I'm going to give really an 8. Again, early on, we're the Church of Latter-day Saints, and that latter day is an allusion to end times. And so it is kind of apocalyptic in how that is formed. But it's that rhetoric has been softened. We still have leaders who will invoke Satan or the adversary as the reason for some of the difficulties and challenges that we have, which feeds into this paranoia aspect. But they've tried to reframe a lot of their conversations into one of hope and of a more positive aspect of that rather than dwelling on the darkness. And so Mormonism has softened quite a bit, but everything that you do is still so that you can be in God's graces at Christ's second coming. And all of these changes that I talked about that the new prophet is doing, there's an undercurrent of messaging that we are hastening the work because Christ is about to come. And if you dig into theology in Mormonism for that, there's a lot of terrible things around his second coming if you're not a believer. And so it's there by inference, but it's not what they focus on.
All right. It's so goofy because, it's like you have this time limit, like you have to accept him. And by the time he shows up, well, it'd be very easy to believe him at that point because he's there. It's right there. I can see him. Yeah, sure. I'll believe it now. Nope, too late.
It's non-falsifiable.
Yeah, it's so stupid. It's just so annoying. Okay, grimness, point number 16. Amount of disapproval concerning jokes about the group, its doctrines, or its leaders. I was impressed that this was actually on the list because it is a commonality. It is a point, but it's not talked about a lot. Scientology definitely is a 10 on this one. There is no joking allowed about the subject of Scientology, period. And Hubbard actually wrote an issue that labels somebody who would be a joker or degrader, as he calls it, is also a psychotic. He makes no, he doesn't soft pedal this at all. You are not to make jokes about Scientology.
I've given a 9 on this. It's not that there isn't a lot of seriousness and, it's just understood that you don't make jokes about the faithful slave. Why would you joke around about God's one and only true organization? It's just that it's not really codified as such. It's not like it's not like it's a disfellowshipping offense to make a joke against Tony Morris or one of the governing body members. But I think 9 is fair.
Yeah. In Mormonism, one of the covenants you make in the temple is to avoid loud laughter or light-mindedness or ill speaking of the Lord's anointed. And those are all, I think, allusions to what they're talking about right here. So Mormons take it very serious in the frame of mind that you're covenanting with God in what is to believe the most sacred space on earth to avoid these things. That's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that we have leaders who have learned that you can connect with an audience and you can become more likable if you make self-deprecating jokes. And if you're a prophet, you can make a marginally funny joke that's self-deprecating and there will be roaring laughter as a result of it. And I loved it when I was listening, when I would hear jokes like that. And so you'll have the culture where we appreciate that leaders can joke about themselves, but we still don't really feel comfortable joking about the leaders. We'll let them joke about themselves. We don't really joke about them. But it's a softer thing than what, when you guys take it so seriously. So,
right. What number did you give that one?
I believe I give him an 8.
8, okay. All right, second to last one is 17, surrender of will. And this was a tough one for me. Amount of emphasis on members not having to be responsible for personal decisions. And then it says degree of individual disempowerment created by the group, its doctrines, or its leaders. Well, I was conflicted on this one because if I was going to say the amount of emphasis on members not having to be responsible for personal decisions, well, it would be a 0 because Scientology is all about individual responsibility and how you have to, you're the one who's responsible for every single thing that's ever happened to you. But I think that it's an inversion within Scientology because they're making you responsible, but they're taking away all your power at the same time. So there's a surrender of will to the bigger body of the church and its dictates and directions and guidelines. So I don't know. I was a little back and forth on this one. So I put an 8.
I put a 10. Maybe I read it differently, but there's not only do you have a situation where it's better to die than go against the teachings in the case of blood transfusions, but you also have material that was published recently talking about how we should obey the organization or the faithful slave, even if they tell us to do something that doesn't make sense from a human standpoint. That's the degree to which the will of the organization supersedes your personal preferences. So I've put a 10 on that.
I remember when you talked about that. That was quite something.
Yeah. I think in Mormonism, what you talked about, the inversion of it, is very much a part of Mormonism. We harp on and on about how everybody has their free agency, but then the secondary message is that the only legitimate use of that free agency is to surrender it to the choices that we've told you are acceptable according to Mormon theology and doctrine. And so we've stopped calling it free agency. We now call it moral agency, because the only things that you can choose legitimately are the things we've defined as moral. And so we give everyone the idea that they are free to choose, but they're only free to choose from the small menu that they have. And if you make choices other than that, then you are considered sinful or wicked or going on your own ways, relying on the flesh. And so there's this weird thing where Mormons feel, and they focus a lot on personal responsibility. I've made the choice. I'm not I'm not brainwashed. But when you step outside of that framework and look at it in the context of people who are truly free to choose, then you can see there's a great deal of control, and the group locks people in that way. And so it's a difficult thing. It's not as controlling as Jehovah's Witnesses. It's not as controlling as certainly some of the other really destructive cults that you might read about. So I give it an 8.
Cool. Yeah, I think you just pretty accurately described the bounded choice model. Mm-hmm. Your choices are bounded. Yeah. And that's something Yanya Lalich has put out there about destructive cults. Okay, and then 18, last one, is hypocrisy. The amount of approval for actions which the group officially considers immoral or unethical when done by or for the group, its doctrines, or leaders. Willingness to violate the group's declared principles for political, psychological, social, economic, military, or other gain. Okay, this one's easy 10 for Scientology. They are one of the most hypocritical groups anywhere that I have ever encountered. And I could list off examples of this all day long. The dogma says this, they do this. Communication is the universal solvent. We have to disconnect everybody who disagrees with us. I mean, there's just conflicting points of dogma and principles all over the place. And Scientologists violate their own principles every single day of the week and see no problem with that.
Strong 10 for Jehovah's Witnesses as well. I've already alluded to the period when Watchtower was a non-governmental organization for the United Nations. During the years that it was declaring the United Nations to be the wild beast of revelation in its literature, but conveniently keeping its political advances out of the picture for rank and file witnesses. And there's also theocratic warfare. Jehovah's Witnesses are not to lie. They're to be truthful and honest in all things. But there's just this loophole where you do get to lie if it's to the advantage of the organization. So, 10.
Yes.
Yeah, I think for Mormonism, it's a higher score, 8 or 9. I think Mormons, they really try to live their doctrines. Just anytime there is a violation or an inconsistency, even if they acknowledge it, they don't acknowledge that it's an inconsistency. They redefine it so it's something else. Famously, we all know that Joseph Smith was a polygamist while he was denying it. When you read the current church talking about it, they say that he didn't deny it or lie. He issued a carefully worded denial, which was based on a private definition of the word polygamy that they had internally that the other world didn't know about, so they could go back and retrofit and say they weren't lying. So we never admit that it's an inconsistency or hypocrisy. We just redefine things. And so it's a little more insidious. It doesn't happen. I don't think they're out doing it as much in terms of Hippocratic actions, but it's certainly their hypocritic actions. Anyway, so I give them an 8.
Cool, man. Yeah, I think my score went up a little bit in the course of this. I think I'm
Mine could have done as well. I'm still ahead of you.
I think I'm running about 136 now or something. So
I could add a few points as well.
Yeah, you added some points as well. Yeah. Well, this was interesting, guys. I actually thought this was a pretty good suggestion, and it turned out it was. And any one of those points could easily take up an entire podcast. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we'll get into that in the future. But I want to wrap this up now. Thanks a lot for your time, guys, on this. I always love comparing and contrasting and chatting and looking at this stuff.
It's an absolute pleasure. It's always good to be here, and hopefully one of these episodes our viewers will get what they want, which is our friend Mr. Streeter demonstrating some of the apparel. The special apparel.
I'm going to start watching your
Streeter on the runway.
Only if I can get Lloyd to sing some of his original renditions of
You're on. You're on. Let's do it.
Okay, excellent. All right, guys. For the viewers out there, thank you very much for coming around. Any questions, comments, feedback, leave it in the comment section here on YouTube or at sensiblyspeaking.com. Always look forward to hearing from you guys. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider supporting me on Patreon. It is what allows us to keep doing this. See you guys next week. Bye-bye.